Hello lovely people, welcome to the Art Hive with me Sarah, and in today's video I've got something a little bit different and I'll be showing you how I'm painting these two illustrations on two different papers. So the paints that I'm using to start with are the Mijello Mission Gold watercolour paints, and the two papers that I'm going to be comparing today are the Arches Aquarelle watercolour paper. So one's hot pressed, one's cold pressed. But other than that, they are the same weight, they're both 100% cotton, and they are both on a block, which means they are sealed on all four sides. We'll talk a little bit about stretching paper later, but because these papers are on a block, it meant I didn't have to worry about that. So before I even added any water to this paper, I was keen to try out my fine liner for my little cartoon beagle dogs and see how it laid down on the different surfaces. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to be doing the cold press drawing on the left hand side and the hot press drawing on the right hand side. And once I start adding some colour to the painting, you'll see that the cold pressed puppy here is going to have a blue ball and the hot pressed puppy is going to have a red ball. So straight away then, when I laid down that fine liner on this cold pressed paper with its textured surface, which was rather rough, I noticed that it was a little bit difficult. So it didn't lay down nearly as smoothly as it did when I tried on the hot pressed paper, which you might expect. It wasn't impossible to get a nice line, but it wasn't as smooth and neat and crisp on the cold pressed paper as it was on the hot pressed paper. So that might be something to bear in mind if you're an illustrator or thinking of doing drawings with outlines. So this smooth texture on this hot pressed paper was a lot easier because this is classed as a fine grain paper, so it doesn't have much texture or any tooth. So hot pressed quite literally means that the paper is hot pressed, like it has been ironed on, and that's in the manufacturing process. So cold pressed, on the other hand, has a bumpy texture with more tooth to it due to the paper being pressed between plates, so either with a fine grain or a felt cloth in manufacture. So that done, I was then keen to see how these two different papers performed with a wet on wet technique, so wet paper and wet paint. Now the paper on the left hand side, the cold pressed paper, was really absorbent, so it really sucked up that wash that I was trying to put on. Because that texture draws the water in, and this meant that the paper is likely to dry more quickly, but does mean that it's easier to control. You haven't got water sort of swimming all over the page. So for that reason, it's considered easier to use for beginners to watercolour and more resilient to having perhaps too much water on it or many layers of paint. And I would consider myself very much a beginner at watercolour, but it's something I'm really keen to explore and improve on in 2018. So you'll have to understand when I probably make mistakes that you might be sitting there thinking about and thinking maybe what's she to say about it. But if you've got any comments or suggestions on technique, or you can see mistakes that I'm making, please, I will not be offended, so drop them in the comments box below. So onto the hot pressed paper, and opposite to the cold pressed paper, as we might expect with that really smooth surface, the water was not absorbed and tended to stay on top of the paper. So this means that you've got a little bit more time before that paint dries if you want to play around with it or add different colours or change your mind even, but it does make it a little bit harder to control, so maybe not as good for beginners. So then I was keen to try the wet on dry technique, and explore the differences when adding different layers of colour. So something that I had heard said, shall we say, is that the quality of the watercolour paper is at least as important as the quality of your paint, which I think when I first heard this did surprise me a bit, because I thought it was all about the quality of the paint, but this isn't so. So let me know what you think about that statement. But certainly I do notice with this better quality and more expensive paper, then you can get some really nice results on, and certainly you can put more layers on and it does seem a nicer paper. But that said, I think if you are a beginner, then it might be worth trying out more student grade papers rather than artist ones before you actually get too proficient at it. So make your mistakes on the cheaper paper, have a go, find out what you like and what you don't like, and indeed maybe watching tutorials and things on YouTube to help you decide what your style is going to be and what paper will suit you best, before you then go in and spend lots of money on the more expensive artist quality. So both of these papers are the same weight, and I said that in the beginning, they're £300 and they are both 100% cotton. So I thought I would just go through what the weight and the cotton content of paper actually means. So whether it's hot pressed or cold pressed, that kind of depends on the way the paper's made, as it might suggest, and I hinted on before. Hot pressed paper is quite literally hot pressed, and they use a smooth press to make that smooth texture, whereas with cold pressed paper they do tend to put the paper between I think it's felt or a more textured surface mechanical press to get that textured surface to it. So that's one difference, and that's why you get all these different qualities to the paper. The weight of it being £300 is to do with the thickness of the paper, since thicker paper can stand up to rougher use, so more paint and more water, and this is a really good weight to try for medium-sized pieces. And as I said, being in a block, you don't need to stretch it. So this is considered a medium weight. There is also another watercolour paper that I haven't mentioned, which is rough texture, but that's not one that I've got, and I'm not going to be comparing that today. So we mentioned about the paper being made of cotton. This is 100% cotton. And what does that mean? So that is to do with the quality of the paper, what it's made from. So cotton paper is best since it's not got any wood pulp in it. So some of the cheaper papers or the student grade papers will have possibly an element of wood pulp in them. And the problem with wood pulp is that it may be slightly acidic, and it's not as strong as cotton. So the acidness of a paper does affect how your paper ages over time. So if there's any acidity in the paper, then it can tend to yellow over time. So the best paper is the 100% cotton, but as I said, that is reflected in the price. So now we've got the main colours on the two little puppies here. We're just adding some more layers. And it's possible to say, I think, that on the cold press paper you do get more of a textured painterly look, and the colours can appear a bit duller on cold press paper, because on the hot press the colours certainly looked a lot more vibrant, and I think that's because the light kind of reflects off the paper and not off the sort of the bumps in the textured cold press paper. And I would say also that lifting any colour up, if you choose to change a colour or lighten it or change your mind, it's a lot harder on the cold press paper compared to the hot press paper. But with the cold pressed you do have a lot more possibilities with different techniques, such as using a dry brush and that kind of thing, which you don't have on the hot press. So I did mention about stretching the paper. Paper stretching is necessary with certain weights of watercolour paper, so it would be necessary with a less thick, less good quality paper, and sometimes if you're doing a larger painting as well. So you do need to kind of pre-wet or pre-soak your paper to stop the top sort of surface of the paper going all bumpy when you add water to it. So any expansion that happens when you add water has already been done if you pre-wet it. You can try and minimise this by taping around the outside of your paper, but that's one thing I did like about this paper in the block, because you didn't have to worry about that at all, and sure enough there wasn't any buckling or wrinkling of the paper. And there are heavier papers available, certainly in the Arches range, and that would be suitable for larger pieces. And for lighter papers and smaller pieces you do need to do that stretching, and I think we're talking kind of £80 to £130 for paper that would need that stretching. But I did find that it was easy to put down several different layers. I mean, this wasn't the most intricate or detailed of pieces, it was just to do two identical dogs to be able to compare the two papers as easily as possible. But I did enjoy doing it, and the layers did tend to go down really well. I did think on the cold press paper I did get a better effect with the grass, a more realistic effect with the grass because of that texture. But then something else about hot press paper that I haven't actually discussed here but have tried before is mixing media. So it is possible and easier on hot press paper to then go back in once your painting is dry and add things like coloured pencil over the top of the paint. And in that way you can get different textures on a smooth surface. And indeed it probably wouldn't add very well to the cold press surface because of all those bumps and lumps, but you might not need it if you were using the cold press anyway, because you can get a really good textured look. So I would say in conclusion, does it matter whether you use hot press or cold press? Yes, because it depends on what effects you want, what you're drawing, and what sort of finish you're after. But I would say it's a good idea to try as many different types of paper as you can, just to experiment with, try those new techniques. But if you are new to watercolour, then I would suggest trying out the cold press first. It's harder wearing, easier to use, and you have more control. And just to reiterate, start with those student grades because watercolour paper is really expensive. So it's best to learn on the cheaper paper before you progress to those expensive ones. And I do think that at the end of the day, whether you choose hot or cold pressed is largely about personal preference, what sort of effect you choose and you prefer, and what you're going to draw. I do actually like both of these illustrations, but I think if I was going to do illustrations with the fine liner, I would definitely go for the hot press paper because the colours are really vibrant and fresh. And if I wanted a more painterly textured style that was possibly more realistic, so not so much of an illustration, then I would go for the cold pressed. But let me know what you think. What paper do you prefer and why? And if you like this video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up, comment and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you all next week, and thank you for watching.